Welcome to the Think Christian podcast, where we're nostalgic for the old days when we were just a blog, typing away. No microphones, no cameras, simpler times. I'm Josh Larson, editor of Think Christian, and I'm happy to be here on the mic talking to you. On this episode, we're going to be considering nostalgia. Now, when it comes to pop culture, nostalgia can sometimes be a dirty word. We use it when we feel someone's giving a pass to a bad movie just because they grew up with it. Space Jam, maybe. I don't know. But is nostalgia a theological word? That's what we're going to discuss. And because there's no such thing as secular, we're going to do it through the lens of two recent pieces of pop culture: the new Lin-Manuel Miranda movie musical, In the Heights, and Lucy Dacus's album, Home Video. One contemplates nostalgia, the other engages in it. Both are very much worth your time. So we're going to bring on Aarik Danielson and Abby Olcese to discuss. You know, C.S. Lewis mentioned that our tendency to be nostalgic it really reveals something fundamental about the human experience. He equated it with our longing to be reconciled with God. In The Weight of Glory, Lewis wrote, "Our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And to be at last summoned inside would be both glory and honor beyond all our merits, and also the healing of that old ache." Let's start our conversation with Abby Olcese and look at how we see that ache revealed in the Heights. Glad to have Abby Olcese with me to talk about In the Heights. How are you holding up in this summer of Lin-Manuel Miranda, Abby? He's already been a talking head in two documentaries, I know. Summer of Soul, I saw him in. I know he's in the Rita Moreno doc. This is the film adaptation of his stage musical, and he shows up in a cameo. He plays Piriguero, a shaved ice peddler, in the film. So is this too much Lin-Manuel Miranda or just enough for you?
We're getting close, I think, to the edge. I really appreciate the vibrancy and positivity that he has brought to the public sphere, but it's been pretty much nonstop. Sorry, the pun is not intended. Since Hamilton, so it's I don't know. I feel like we've reached saturation. So
we have.
I appreciate In the Heights. I do think it's good, but yeah, I feel like I'm even in things where you don't think he's going to show up, like in Summer of Soul. He and his dad will appear for like a few minutes, and you're just like,
right.
But why?
Here too.
Yeah.
Well, it helps me that I find him really delightful in the Heights,
Yes.
in that cameo. It's one of my favorite bits. So that helps as well. The movie itself, he didn't direct it. It's actually directed by John M. Chu, who we know from Crazy Rich Asians. And it is a big, bold, boisterous movie musical. The stars Anthony Ramos, he plays Usnavi, a young man who runs a bodega in the New York City neighborhood of Washington Heights, but he dreams of moving back to his native Dominican Republic. How about movie musicals in general, Abby? Are they your thing? And tell me how it sounds like this one did work for you pretty well.
Yeah, I enjoy a movie musical. I am a little more old school in the ones that I like the most. Like I appreciate a bit more talking in my movie musical or my musicals
Okay.
in general than I feel like we've gotten like post Les Mis or Rent, where it's just like everything is sung. It's like an opera in English.
Yeah.
This one I feel like works for me just because it seems like music is such an important part of the culture that Lin-Manuel Miranda is portraying, that like it definitely makes sense. Like I don't really mind
Sure.
it because it just feels more natural.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's right. So much of the storytelling, you get a sense of the songs that we learn about or we hear in the movie, they're telling a story themselves. And that is part of the cultural tradition. These are cultures where storytelling is done through song as well. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how the culture we see here, cultures really relate to this idea of nostalgia that I wanted to dig into, because it's a very culturally specific sort of nostalgia at work in this movie. You know, it's not only Usnavi who has this longing for a previous time and place, but many of the residents in Washington Heights, most of whom hail from across the Caribbean. So places like Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico or Cuba. So there's that nostalgia at play, but there's also nostalgia for the neighborhood itself, for this New York City neighborhood, because as we learn in the opening number, it's rapidly changing due to gentrification. So there are new stores, new store owners in the neighborhood. Some people are moving out to go to a different neighborhood. So, in a couple of ways, this is really a nostalgia soaked movie. Before we get to the text of the film, did it make you nostalgic for anything in your own life? Just be sitting in this kind of mood, this mind space? Did it hit any of those buttons for you?
That's a good question. It did, actually. I spent my elementary school years growing up in Chicago in a very multiculturally diverse neighborhood. And a few of my just like right after college, like my post college years, I spent in Washington, D.C., which is also a very culturally diverse place, depending on where you live. At the places that I lived, it was. Yeah, summer in the city in general is just like it's so much fun, and that heat and, like, just the liveliness of everywhere and, like, people having barbecues and parties in their backyard. I miss that. I have nostalgia for that every summer, regardless of whether or not I'm watching a movie like In the Heights, and so this captured that vibe really well, and it made me miss some of the things that I remember experiencing when I was young and impressionable and enjoyed stuff like public pools and, like,
Yeah.
popsicles from a corner store.
Yeah, yeah, when everyone's kind of thrown together, as you say, when the weather brings everyone out, and there are certain places of the city where the neighborhoods kind of meet and come together too sometimes in a place like
Yeah,
Chicago. I think of like Taste of Chicago, going to that as a kid, the big food festival, and you had people from like not only the surrounding neighborhoods, but the suburbs, sometimes out of state. It was just like this mass of humanity. And yeah, watching this movie, it hit me a little bit. There's the scene of Usnavi, when he's leaving this apartment that he's been in for so long. You get a sense maybe most of his life he's grown up in, he's moving out of it. We just moved last summer and he's walking around in these empty rooms. I'm like, oh no, I thought I was past, feeling have pangs of nostalgia from moving out of a house I'd been in for 17 years. And this
yeah.
kind of brought it back. So it's a really moving film, joyful as well. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. It was also interesting to watch, with C.S. Lewis's understanding of nostalgia in mind, this more theological perspective that Lewis wrote about, where he argued, our longing for an earlier time in our lives, our childhoods, or something else is a hint of our deeper spiritual longing. So a longing to return to right relationship with God, even to the way things were before the fall, because Lewis would say that this is something we remember deep in our bones, even though
Mm.
it is not something that was in our lifetime. We have that spiritual nostalgia. And in the movie, this really kind of was resonated in the moment where Usnavi is looking at those photos of his father's old beachfront bodega back in the DR. So he's pursuing this dream to return. And part of it is because he wants to rebuild this bodega on the beach that his father ran. But he looks at these photos and we see them, and through a storm and over the years, it's been demolished. So it's
Mm.
really, not this place that you think you'd want to go to, but he still hatches a plan to buy it and restore it to the glory of his childhood memories. So I think that was a moment for me that was kind of in line with Lewis's ideas, but I don't know if anything like that stood out to you from the film.
Yeah, for sure. The other character who there are 3, I think, big characters that I feel like have really strong nostalgic ties. One of them is Usnavi, another is Abuela. She has her song about her memories of Cuba and whether or not she wants to go to the DR with Usnavi or stay where she had all these formative experiences. But the one that I think stood out to me the most was Nina, the
Mm,
character who has gone away to college and is coming back after I think her first semester, having dropped out but not told anybody about it because she felt so much pressure to like be the one that got out and be successful. Which is, I mean, it's a real pressure that a lot of people from underrepresented communities feel when they hit college. It's a pretty common thing, and so it's great to see that represented. But also, she has a couple of numbers where she is like literally walking through a crowd and following a version of her younger self, like where she sees kind of a spiritual manifestation of herself as a child, kind of running around and enjoying the neighborhood when things were more innocent, when she was just like the smart, overachieving kid in her class and she didn't feel like pressures to perform in front of people she didn't know, when she felt like she had an actual community. And these are all importantly, these flashbacks are happening during songs where she's talking about how she feels like she's such a disappointment to the people around her. And a large part of her journey is realizing that she is not, that she has the ability to kind of take what this community has given her into her growing understanding of what life outside of her neighborhood is like.
Yeah, I think that number is "Breathe," is the one
Mhm.
you're referencing, and I love the touch of her as a child that she looks back and sees her kinda just spinning and dancing down the sidewalks at a what feels like what she remembers as a more innocent time. Nina played by Leslie Grace. And it is a through line for her character because there's a later number, I believe, "When You're Home," where she sings with Corey Hawkins,
Yeah.
and they relay their memories together when they, as high schoolers, it seems to be they were a couple for a time in high school and are kind of remembering what it was like. Again, a little simpler than where they find themselves now, kind of on the verge of adulthood in
Mhm.
different places and how that feels different to them. You know what else I thought was interesting in terms of just nostalgia and maybe even a Christian understanding is the end of the movie, and I don't wanna spoil it, but I think we can say that it ends in a place that's not necessarily a return, but it's kind of a new creation in a
Mhm.
way of what we get, what we see there, the space we're actually in, and I do think that connects with Lewis's thoughts because, he would say nostalgia points ahead to the full restoration of things, but it's built upon things that, the original creation. It's built on that as well, God's vision for humanity. So there was an echo there for me at the ending. Some people aren't as high on the ending, and there's a distinction between the stage musical, how that ended, and people don't like that. Did it work for you where In the Heights ended up?
It did, and I think it worked on a couple of different levels. I think I mean, obviously there are several character arcs that go through the movie, and a lot of them have different ideas of they go from a place of nostalgia being an unhelpful thing and dividing you from the places you need to go and the things that you need to understand and ways you need to grow, to a I think ways that we can kind of carry the places that we live with us or carry the memories that we've had into kind of, yeah, like you said, a new creation, something that celebrates where we are, something that maybe helps us better the places that we're going instead of a place that we just like perpetually miss and wish we could get back to but can't. So it
Mm.
becomes a much more, I think, pragmatic use of the idea of nostalgia and memory and remembering things that we have lost, as well as what those things have taught us that we can keep with us moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else you wanted to touch on about the film? Was there a standout production number for you or any of the characters, the performances jump out? What else should we hit before we wrap up here?
I, like many people, I'm a fan of the 96,000 number at the swimming pool. I think it's such a wonderfully creative way of shooting that setting, and the backup dancing throughout this is just incredible.
Yeah.
Like, the crowd work that John M2 works with is, like, it's really reminiscent of old classic musicals, and I feel like nowhere is that more apparent than in 96,000 because you have, like, a pool full of people on, like, pool rings or like by the side, like talking. And it's just, it feels like you're getting all of these little individual microcosms of conversation that are set against this backdrop of like everybody in a community coming together and just having a really great time. But everything is also just really highly choreographed and impressive. Things that sort of take you out of your body and out of your experience and just bring you to a more colorful and happier place. I feel like that's something that really does it for me.
It's colorful indeed, absolutely. And yeah, throughout the film, there are different dance styles being demonstrated because as we've said, these are different cultures being represented that are coming together in this neighborhood. And so I do love that too. Even in the background, I think When You're Home is another example. That
Yeah.
song, we're focusing on Leslie Grace and Corey Hawkins, but behind them you can see there are people doing their own sort of dancing. And often they just look like normal people. They don't look like movie stars either. That was a really nice touch.
Yeah.
Before we go, I do want to plug Emmanuel Padilla wrote on the TC website about In the Heights, and he took a little bit of a different angle, touches on nostalgia too, but he describes the characters in the movie as exiles and compares them to the Israelites in exile in Babylon and how they longed for Jerusalem. So Emmanuel, he weaves in some of his own family history there as immigrants from Puerto Rico. It's a really great read. So I encourage people to check that out. Again, it's at thinkchristian.net. Thank you, Abby, for coming on to talk about it here. Movies, they've been ramping up in theaters. Is there anything else you've seen recently that you can recommend, or maybe something you've written about elsewhere you want to point listeners to?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's been a pretty exciting summer to get back into the theater. And I've been enjoying a lot of stuff that is out currently or forthcoming. I know I wrote about F6 in my write up for TC on movies to watch for Pentecost.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I did see F9 recently in a theater full of people, and it was one of the best experiences I've had in a long time. It was so much fun. It was like all of the explosions and goofy stuff that you go to the movies for, some really interesting meta commentary
Mm,
about some of the characters maybe having certain realizations about their adventures over the years.
yes.
There's a podcast called Galaxy Brains that Polygon puts out that I think recently discussed that element of it with actually some spiritual connotations too.
Interesting. Okay.
In a recent episode. So I would highly recommend people check that out because it's a really fun exploration of stuff that I've been thinking about for a while. I think Sarah Welch Larson kind of has too. We've been talking about it on Twitter a little bit. It's just like,
Nice.
I don't know. After Alien, that might be the next great franchise to tackle in book form.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, it's obviously worth exploring. You've written about it. I wrote about F7, Furious 7 for the TC. So, yes, much good spiritual content in that series. Well, thanks for that, Abby. And thanks again for being on the show. Take care of yourself, okay?
Thanks, Josh. You too.
Hey everyone, John J. Thompson, your professional podcast playlist programmer, inviting you to check out the special mix I've curated around this nostalgia theme. You can find it by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify or check the link in the emails you get from us or over on the website. Nostalgia has been a common theme in all forms of popular music for as far back as popular music has been a thing. There's nothing like a song to take you back. As usual, we can't play any of the music here on the YouTube feed, but you'll hear one of the songs from the In the Heights soundtrack, one from A Star is Born, and many more. If there's a song that makes you think of the old days, tweet at me at John J. Thompson, and I just might add it to the mix. But remember, the past is a fine place to visit, as long as we don't try to live there.
Josh Larson back with the TC podcast, joined by Aarik Danielson. We're going to talk about the new Lucy Dacus album, Home Video. Catch me up on Lucy Dacus, Aarik. You had mentioned a while back that you wanted to write a piece about this album for TC, so we were talking about it a little bit. The more you talked about it, the more I realized it could probably fit pretty nicely into the theme of this show, nostalgia.
Yeah.
So we thought a conversation would be good, but otherwise I was only vaguely familiar with Lucy Dacus, so fill me in here at the start.
Yeah, so Home Video, I think, is her third full-length record. She put out her first in 2016. She didn't really cross my radar until her second record, which was Historian in 2018, but just a phenomenal singer-songwriter. I mean, indie rock is such a huge catch-all term, but in that world, and a lot of people kind of know her by association because she's part of this kind of young supergroup called Boy Genius with Julian Baker and Phoebe Bridgers. And they've only made one EP together, but there's such a tight-knit kind of friendship and collaboration between those three artists that I think people kind of tend to think of them as a group. And I mean, to my mind, probably three of the best young singer-songwriters. I mean, I would be surprised, I'd have to look, but if one of them is over 25 or 26, but three of just the best singer-songwriters working today. So yeah, hopefully folks that we'll be hearing from for 30 or 40 years, going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've written about Julian Baker and Phoebe Bridgers at TC as well, just doing some phenomenal work and really interesting, somewhat in the same register to my ears, but each very distinct and idiosyncratic within
sure.
that sort of genre that they share. I think for me, listening to Dacus, it's the voice that just really grabs you right away. It's very quiet, but somehow you get the sense it could still cut through walls. It has this strength to it that really becomes clear when the guitars in some of these songs kick in. And then they're big guitars, they're burly guitars, but her singing holds its own against them. And she doesn't have to strain to do that. So it's just a really unique voice that has those two qualities to it, I think.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's this beautiful alto with this lower register. And she did kind of this series of covers in between the last couple of records where, she can pull off, kind of this slow, ethereal cover of Dancing in the Dark by Springsteen, but then do a rendition of La Vie en Rose. And her voice is beautiful enough and sturdy enough and rich enough that she can pull off that range vocally and then make it her own. So yeah, her voice is lyrically, as we're going to talk about, her voice is really strong, but I think it carries even further because of her literal like instrument, her physical voice.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's turn to home video and some of those lyrics then, some of these stories she's telling, these memories she's sharing. I do think most of the songs, it seems to me, you could say, not all of them, but most of them are directly trading in some sort of nostalgia. Now, as you said, she's young. I think she is 26. So reminiscing about, the relatively recent past. Sometimes we
Right.
think of nostalgia as going back way further. And she's talking about her youth here, who she was expected to be as an adolescent, how that compares to who she is now. And a lot of this has to do, at least on home video, it seems to me, there are a couple of songs. It has to do with being raised as a church kid and the condemnation she felt, especially as she grew older and began to negotiate her sexuality. So overall, how would you characterize the album's understanding of nostalgia? The sort of looking back that many of these songs do. It seems to me you could describe it maybe as bittersweet at best, but there's a lot of pain here too.
Yeah, I think bittersweet is a good word. I mean, maybe poignant is, I don't know how specific that gets for people, but one of the things that I'm impressed with, and maybe part of it is, like you said, it's nostalgia, but it's relatively recent, is that, there's no romanticizing of the past really in these songs, but also she's willing to name every kind of heartache and every sort of hurt that she experienced, but I also don't get the sense that she's fully dwelling in them either. There's kind of this almost like preternatural wisdom that she achieves where she's able to kind of step back and almost see herself as a character in these stories, and share how difficult they were, but also, already kind of be able to frame them and say, here are the things that I've learned from them, or here's what I've sifted from this, and kind of being able to sift the good and the bad, which again, I think is why, I think Julian Baker, again, in that cohort kind of does similar things, why they're such impressive songwriters, because, I think songwriters 20 years older than that aren't always able to do that. And so just that ability to say the past was really difficult and challenging. And in many ways it kind of broke me, but it also made me who I am. And I can't really extricate those two things. It's just really powerful.
Yeah, there's a bit of distance, an emotional distance, even maybe to some of the experiences that you wouldn't expect from someone who is so recently removed from them in years. And you describe them as stories. I think that's exactly right. So many of these the details are just so specific. And whether she is writing exactly about herself or someone she knew or someone she's imagining, you just feel immersed in these stories, just digging into these complicated feelings that she had for others, and especially under the shadow of a condemning sermon, as she talks about there. So any songs on the album that stood out to you or you wanted to be sure to highlight, Aarik?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I think two that I'll highlight really quickly is, I could say so much about the opening track, Hot and Heavy, but the first line is the perfect first line for this album, where she literally just says, "Being back here makes me hot in the face." And you're just like, that just perfectly sets up this album where she's going to go back and retrace all of these steps that she's taken. But I think for our purposes and even just, kind of thinking back on my own experience, I mean, the song VBS is really powerful, where she's literally describing herself as a kid at VBS and how, she's kind of almost being groomed by, it sounds like a pastor or youth pastor to be a leader. They look at her and see this kid who has potential to really kind of spark faith in others. And then just kind of what a burden that is, and how, as she begins to understand, again, like you said, more of who she is, more of herself as a sexual being and as a romantic being, and as just, a more, I guess, critical thinker in so many ways, just begins to see how she's not who, they think she is, and then just how that dissonance really unsettles her. And so I think even those of us who've remained in the faith and would say, that we're still steadfast in that, can still think back to, childhood experiences where what was being asked of us and what we were capable of or what we really wanted were not the same thing. And so I don't know, there's, I think growing up in the church, growing up as a pastor's kid, all of those things for me, that song really registers, even though, she and I may kind of end the song in different places. But I certainly have experienced those feelings.
It's funny reading some reviews of the album when they get to VBS. They'll have to explain, oh, this means Vacation Bible School,
Right.
And then probably the majority of Think Christian listeners are like, yeah, we get it. We're on top of that. But yeah, I like what you said there, and it makes me think back to my own experiences, whether it's like a summer camp or VBS or something, or even watching, my kids in more recent years. Sometimes, we want to be in those places and we send our kids to those places for that spiritual formation. But what she seems to be writing about there is if it's forced maybe too soon or too much, or then it doesn't feel like even at a young age you can own it. And it's
Mhm.
probably hard to own it, right? That's what spiritual formation is. This is a tradition we are born into, and we want to learn about. So to an extent, you need that formation, but I think it can cross the line, which is maybe what she's touching on, is that before it can become true to a child, we expect more of them than is maybe healthy. I don't know. Maybe that's something that the song is getting at in a way.
Yeah. I mean, trust me, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I understand the instinct, but I think in a lot of, especially evangelical circles, we're so desperate to save the souls of these kids that come across our path, whether it's in a vacation Bible school setting or a Sunday school setting. And we don't really maybe wrestle fully with like heaven and hell and sin and salvation, all those concepts that are, as adults, we don't really still know how to wrap our minds around
Mm,
how difficult that is for a child to like deal with the weight of that, I guess. And especially if you're saying, not only do I want this for you, but I think that you have the potential to be a leader in this way. And this kid is going, I don't even know who I am yet. I
mm.
don't know I can't process these things. And so I think there's maybe something kind of heartbreaking, but instructive even in that song of saying like, we should want good things for children spiritually. We should want that spiritual formation, but do we have an understanding of, how to, I don't know, the long game, I guess, the long haul,
Mm.
the leading someone through spiritual formation their entire life versus trying to kind of lead them to this precipice so early on.
Yeah.
And
Get
I
that
think kind of,
win.
yeah, I think the weight of that, the gravity of that really comes through in that song.
So I don't want this to be a saving the souls question, but I was thinking, listening to these stories on this album and hearing where either Dacus herself or the characters, the personas, however you want to think about this, where this voice is right now, I do wonder what might the gospel have to say to someone singing these songs, someone resonating with these songs, even, when your nostalgia over growing up in the church is tied to rejection and pain,
Mm,
what can still be offered to to keep that long game going in your term? Do you have any? It's a hard question,
yeah.
but I'm wondering if anything like that crossed your mind as a response as you're hearing these songs.
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenging question. I think that this is going to sound like a simple answer, and I don't actually think it is. But the first thing that runs through my mind is just simply that God knows. We look at the songs of a Lucy Dacus and say, "Wow, what amazing self awareness and how well she knows herself and her own experiences," and that's absolutely true. But the truth that like God knows what she's felt and what all of us have felt better than we can express. And I think that all the ways that we've been hurt and all the ways that we've struggled, and I think he looks and sees like you don't have to either feel bad because you didn't live up to what these people were asking of you, or when you were kind of treated as a number, or just not as yourself individually, by somebody. I knew who you were, and I cared about you as who you were, and I just think that when we kind of talk about nostalgia, it's almost like there's this. We always think that there's this like pure ideal of the past that we need to
Yeah.
recapture, and for people like Lucy Dacus in these songs, she's saying like, no, I don't have that. So what am I supposed to do? I don't have this pure past to kind of pine for. And I think that the gospel, or the way that we think about who God is, would just say like, no, there's no like pure, life for you to return to, no innocent life for you to return to. We're all experiencing tastes of heaven and hell, tastes of good and bad, tastes of, heartache and joy all the time. We're works in progress. And where somebody else may have singled you out in a moment, God knows you from beginning to end, and cares about you from beginning to end. And so I don't know if that's always reassuring to people, but I think there's something kind of beautiful about the idea that like each of those moments, but also the entire timeline of our lives, God knows us as we are. And maybe there's some comfort to be had there.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it's not an answer that we necessarily have to give at this moment or right now, but It's to keep listening too, to offer what you said as much as we've experienced it, but also just, well, we want to hear what your continuing journey is. And, especially if it's given in incredible music like this. So we dug into a lot of the lyrics, some specifics here. Is there anything just, you wanted to cover more generally about the album or anything else you want to make sure we wanted to touch on, Aarik?
I don't know as far as like the themes we've talked about. I still think I actually was just listening to this one more time before we talked, and there's a song on the record called Thumbs that I think is not only one of the best songs I've heard this year, it might be one of the best short stories I've heard
Yes.
this year, and one
Yeah.
of the best films. It's cinematic, it's
Totally.
all those things. I just so value, I mean, we've already talked about this, but I just so value artists who are both deeply self-aware, and that self-awareness leads to compassion, which I think that Dacus really exhibits on this record. And I really appreciate too that even in those songs where she might express disappointment in someone that she wanted to be in a relationship with, or might express disappointment in the church, it never feels damning. It's always with compassion, and saying like, I didn't fully understand my own motives, you didn't either. We were all kind of doing the best that we could, but here's where it landed us. And I think that song really expresses that well. So many do. And that's the kind of art that I want to be around. I want to be around musicians and artists who are just willing to say, again, we're all works in progress. We're all trying. And how can we kind of help each other see what we're all going through, the things that we share, the heartaches that we've all experienced. And I'm just so grateful for artists like her. I really am hopeful that she'll, continue to make this kind of music for another 30 or 40 years, because this is the kind of artist I want to grow along with, and I kind of want to watch her continue to grow up on these records. So
Thumbs is maybe the most wrenching song, but also I'd agree. Yeah. One of the best too. All right. So you're not going to end up writing about home video for TC Aarik, but last month you did write another piece for us. I want to point out on Chris Thile. So maybe give listeners a quick sense of what you tackled there.
yeah, I was just thinking if you like this conversation, you would like that piece, because that record, his record Lay Songs, Chris Thile, of course, one of the leaders of the group Nickel Creek and Punch Brothers, and kind of this man about culture in so many ways. Basically writing an album he wrote some of the songs, some are covers, but basically hymns for agnostics, I would say, songs about not having faith anymore, but also kind of having the shape of faith and community and organized religion still in your life. And what do you do with that when that was kind of the predominant shape of your life, and you take kind of the core of that away? What happens? And again, I think there's a similarity there. They're very, very different records, but with Thile and Dacus, of being able to call out the church's sins, but not ultimately laying blame, but just kind of saying, here's what this was, and we all kind of need to deal with it as it was, and it doesn't really do us much good to tear into each other or whatever, but we need to just hear each other out, and that's the only way we're going to kind of make up for this dissonance and make up for this gap. So in a very different way musically, very different way lyrically, I think there's some real common ground there.
Both offering a sort of witness, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe there's something about where I'm at right now that I'm drawn to that kind of stuff. But I just, as someone who's continuing to wrestle with and try to refine his own faith, I feel like if I'm not perceptive and listening to people who are at very different places than I am, then I'm going to miss things, and I'm going to have blind spots that I can't account for. And so I both want to love my neighbor by hearing them out, but I think it's also loving myself by being changed and shaped by other people's stories.
So that post on Chris Thile, that's up at thinkchristian.net right now. Thanks for coming on the show, Aarik. We'll talk to you again soon, okay?
All right. Thank you, Josh.
For C.S. Lewis, nostalgia was not a dead end, but a hint of a way forward. It resurrects what came before and revives it for the new creation. I think there's hope for that in the Heights. There's probably more of a yearning for it in the music of Lucy Dacus's home video. Thanks to Aarik Danielson for listening alongside me to what Dacus shares in her music, and thanks to Abiel Chessie for joining me to talk about In the Heights. If you want to follow them on Twitter, let me spell their names for you just so you can be sure to find them. Aarik Danielson is Aarik Danielsen, and then Abby is Abbyolcese. You can also connect with us on Twitter and on Facebook. Find us at Think Christian. Now, for our YouTube viewers, you missed out on a couple of tracks from John J. Thompson's Spotify playlist that he compiled to go along with the theme of this episode. If you want to check that out, go go ahead and search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more information. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy, that's Robin Basley. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another corner of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.